Hello there, and welcome to Lesson 3, Critical Reading Part 2, with a specific subject of analyzing visuals. This is one of my favorite lessons from the whole quarter, and you're about to see why. But first, before we dive into the lecture, we're at a point where we've had two pretty in-depth lectures. I think it would help us to do just some really quick recall where we review what we've learned in the first two lectures. So first off is the course goal. Lesson 1, I quoted from one of my favorite authors, and I said, anything can be a text, and all writing creates change. So you could have a goal in this course to pass the course, move on to English 201, pass that course, and never have to take a writing course again. And that's important. We need to get that done. I do not mean in any way to diminish the importance of that goal. But I think we can aim higher. And so if we believe the statement to be true, that all writing creates change, and this is a writing course, why not make that the goal? How much higher can you aim than to create change? And if we pair that with the previous statement from the same author that anything can be a text, then when we say all writing creates change, writing goes beyond the typical forms we think it usually takes. It could be recording a podcast, making a film, drawing a painting, making a poster, a Facebook post, creating a video game, all kinds of things. That's why in this stated course goal here, I use the term communication rather than writing. I think writing can be interpreted very broadly, but when we just see that word, we think of the traditional writing. So our course goal then, to sum up, is to learn to create change through effective communication. And everything we do this quarter will be working toward that goal. What are some of the things we've done so far? The first most foundational thing of the two foundational concepts we've studied, foundational to this goal, is rhetoric. In lesson 1, we talked about rhetoric. What is rhetoric? It's the study and use of effective communication. So essentially the study of effective communication, right? Studying the means by which we will create change. Studying writing would be a really simple way to put that. But I put the study and use of effective communication because rhetoric is this Greek word that means persuasion. And so we study that, we study the art of persuasion, but then we also perform it. And so I've bolded those two words intentionally, and they really encapsulate the first two halves of this course. In the first half, we'll study how others use rhetoric, and in the second half, we'll learn to deploy our own rhetorical strategies. The second foundational concept was critical reading, which is pretty self-explanatory in terms of just a definition, learning how to read text more deeply, going beyond scratching the surface. But why do this? As I said before, so many studies show that better readers become better writers, or in this case, the term I'm using, communicators, and vice versa. There's a symbiotic, cyclical relationship there, where if you learn to read really, really well, challenge yourself to become a more active, less passive reader, your writing will get better. And if you really work on your writing, revise, write multiple drafts, really become a better writer, you'll be able to read things critically more easily. A lot of studies show that. So finally, where are we today with today's lesson? Being that this is our goal, and rhetoric and critical reading are our two main ways to achieve it. You could say that rhetoric is how we create change, and critical reading is the study of how others have used rhetoric effectively, to sum up. But where are we today? As I said last time, critical reading needs to go beyond the written word. So we can learn to read articles, books critically, and that will help us tremendously in college, and we really did kind of, you could say, extensive practice with that last time. Here, though, we're going to go beyond those written words and we're going to do visual analysis, hence the title of today's lecture. So in the 21st century, in 2022, you need to be able to critically read all kinds of text, not just traditional print ones. So reading films, reading video games, reading social media posts. We can turn a critical eye to all of those things, but we can't use the exact same strategy. So how do we adapt our critical reading strategies for different rhetorical situations? Today, we're going to use the specific rhetorical situation of the film Captain America Civil War. I assigned this film as assigned reading. It counts as reading, just as anything can be a text with writing, so it falls under our definition of reading. And in this lecture, we're going to critically read it. We're going to practice critically reading it. So hopefully you've already watched it, because there'll be spoilers here. If not, you should stop the lecture and go watch it now. I know this class doesn't use a textbook, and so I chose this film for a variety of reasons. One being that many people have a subscription to Disney Plus, so you can watch it easily. If not, you should be able to do a free trial of Disney Plus or rent it for as low as $4. If you have any questions or issues with that, just send me an email. So we're going to start by reviewing the critical reading strategies from last time. Then we'll look at how to apply those to a visual text, a motion visual text like a film. And finally, we'll do an example of it with Civil War. So the first was adjusting your reading speed, going at different paces for different texts. I'm going to review these quickly just so they're fresh in your mind, but it was the last lesson, so we're not going to linger over them. Adjusting your pace for different types of texts. Some are more demanding than others, and the more demanding texts we learn to read, the more challenging ones, the better we'll become not just at reading but also writing. But obviously you have to take those challenging or demanding texts more slowly. Annotating, so highlighting, making notes in the margins as you read. Remember, again, a lot of studies show that writing something down as you read it helps you remember it better. Summarizing in your own words. The truest way to demonstrate that you fully understood something is to rephrase the ideas in your own words, not just quote. Identifying and analyzing the rhetorical situation. So starting now to go past summary and to dig more deeply. Who wrote this text? Why did they write it? What was their goal? Did they achieve their goal? What was their genre? How did they use credibility, emotion, logic, timing to try to achieve that goal? Identifying patterns. So what are things that appear multiple times, that recur throughout the text? Those are keys, if you will, things we can hone in on as like a way to decipher the text. And reading the written word, like we did last week, you want to look for ideas or concepts and then key words, key phrases. We'll talk today about how to find key visuals. Analyzing the argument. So what is the argument the author makes? And I use the term author very broadly too. If you have an article written by just one person, then we can take that term author in a very literal sense. But there are also authors of the film Captain America Civil War, the directors, writers, producers, actors, many more. But I'm just going to use the term author collectively to refer to whomever, even if it's a group of people that created a text. So what are they saying in this text, through this text, and how well do they say it? How do they try to achieve that? One thing you can do to analyze the argument is play the believing and doubting game. So take the argument once you've identified it. Is it true? Play that tape to the end and go through all their logical reasoning and see if it holds up. Then doubt their argument. Say it's not true. Play the tape to the end the other direction. Try to pick apart all their logic, see what holds up or not. That'll give you a much better sense of if you think the argument is fair, whether you agree with it next, whether you agree with it or not, and next, how do you want to respond? Finally, consider the larger context. Every writer has influences. We talked about that in lesson 1 and 2. They can't escape their influences. So what culturally, historically, socially influenced the text that they created? All right, so let's take these terms and adapt them for a specifically visual medium. So adjusting your reading speed, you could pause what you are watching. You could watch it multiple times. This would apply to a film or a show. Obviously, you could analyze a painting or a poster, like a still image, and then this wouldn't be as much of a factor. But just like I've mentioned, pausing the lecture to take notes, you want to do that if you're critically reading, not just passively watching, but actively watching a film or a show. And of course, when it's paused, take notes. You can still annotate, even if it's on your TV screen. Summarize in your own words. So it would be basically just right before, write out a short description. If someone asked you to tell them, sum up Captain America Civil War in 1 or 2 sentences, how would you do it? What would you say? What are the most important things a person needs to understand to know at a basic level what this film is about? Identifying and analyzing the rhetorical situation. This isn't really any different. You'd want to identify the author, their purpose, their message, and ultimately consider whether they achieve their goal or not and how they use rhetorical strategies to do it. A couple important factors here that we haven't talked about in as much detail that very much come into play here are genre as well as medium and design. So if you look at Captain America Civil War, that's a superhero film, action adventure, maybe some sci-fi. There's certain expectations audiences have, and they'll be disappointed if the film doesn't meet those expectations. So genre is very important with visual text. Obviously, medium and design is important there. It's important even in a written text, as we talked about last time, but obviously so much more so in a visual text. And going back to genre for just a second to illustrate its importance as a factor in the rhetorical situation, think about just Marvel versus DC for a second. Like Captain America Civil War, very serious movie, serious, dramatic, intense content, but plenty of excellent humor intermixed throughout. By the time this came out, that was considered a staple, that humor, a consistent, constant part of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And so if the film, despite its intensity, did not have that humor paired with the intensity, it would be a letdown for viewers. So you have broad genres like action, subgenres like superhero within action, and finally, even more specific, even within a genre already as specific as superhero, specifically Marvel. So genre is an important factor when you consider the rhetorical situation. And so how do we identify patterns in a visual rather than written text? There may not be really key words, but there might be key images. I call those visual cues. So you see the same image repeated throughout. And instead of key concepts like ideas, you might have ideas, but I would phrase it a little bit more as a theme. If you're watching something like a documentary, which is kind of like an essay turned into a film, key concept would work. But in this case, think of themes. What are the prominent themes throughout here? Like friendship or brotherhood might be a couple examples, quick ones with Captain America Civil War. Analyzing the argument. So all texts present images and try to create change. This doesn't change as much as you think it would when going from written to visual media. Obviously, if someone writes an article and publishes it in the Atlantic or the New Yorker or somewhere, they've got a pretty clear goal. They're clearly making an argument. A text like Captain America Civil War that seems like it's produced and created primarily for entertainment value, the message or the argument might not be as clear, but rest assured there is one there, which is when I talk about analysis of visual text, I tend to use the term message or meaning more so than argument. But that's just a different way of phrasing the same thing, phrasing in a way that makes more sense for this particular medium, visual rather than written. But all texts present arguments, and they all try to create change. It's something we can be asking throughout this lecture is how does Captain America Civil War try to create change? And believing and doubting, again, that's not really different either. Play the tape to the end for both. So once you know what the message of the film is, do you agree with it? Do you believe they presented it in a convincing way, the authors? Say yes and examine that. Say no and examine that. Then you can arrive at your ultimate conclusion, your opinion of the text. And of course, the larger context is important no matter what kind of text you're studying. You always need to consider the context from which it came, because that can drastically influence the content produced. In some cases, more so than others, but always to some degree. So consider it. All right, we're going to attempt now a visual critical reading of Captain America Civil War. But one last question first you might be asking is, why Captain America Civil War? I could have chosen essentially anything for this lecture, and there would be many fruitful choices, but content is important. There's a reason, an impetus behind the content I've chosen. What is it? To answer this question, I'm going to borrow from my English 201, kind of surprising their syllabus, since this is English 101. Because in English 201, I use the genre of superhero films and comics as a means to teach the course. They are our framework or our foundation in English 201. So we look at lots of superhero texts in that class to try to understand our world better and to get better at writing. I introduced that in a miniature way in 101 by looking at Civil War in this lesson and a few other examples. So not to the same degree in 101 and not to the degree that I've included this language on the actual syllabus, because we have a more general, less specific approach in 101, but enough so that I've included it here on this lecture. So let's take a look at why superheroes. Firstly, the recent rise in popularity of the superhero genre demonstrates the fundamental human desire to believe in something greater than oneself. So these are longer than the kind of bullet points I usually have on a PowerPoint because they're full of sentences listed from my 201 syllabus, but I think that's the most effective way in this particular scenario to explain the rationale for studying superheroes in this course. So superhero films have become just crazy popular the last 10 years. And we can ask why. But the fact that they've become that popular is reason alone enough to study them. But I would argue in a class like this, but I would argue that one of the reasons why is we all have a fundamental desire within us to see and believe in something greater than ourselves. Many people these days say they don't believe in God anymore. But even if that's true for many people, I don't think that the desire to believe in something like a God has gone away. And so since that desire exists in us, we gravitate toward things like superheroes. Now, you can believe in God and love superheroes too, but the point is that the rise in popularity of the superhero genre points to this fundamental need that exists within us all. So what makes superheroes really interesting is they are these godlike individuals that draw us to them through their supernatural abilities. But once we get an up-close look, we realize that even though they're godlike in some ways, they're also very much like us. They have a lot of the same problems and issues and struggles as us, and that creates a very compelling character who we want to watch more and study more. So if these heroes face similar struggles to us, then these films and books and shows can really speak to real-world problems. And I believe a lot of the more recent films do this very directly, and Civil War is a prime example, which we'll look at in a minute. Finally, if this is all true, if you've played the believing and doubting game with my statements here, as you well should, and you've chosen to believe after playing the tape to the end both ways, the three statements I've explained before this final statement, then you have to accept the final statement as true as well. And that is that Superheroes then can help us confront the problems of our world. If they're battling villains and the struggles they face are reflections of the problems we face, then they can give us unique ways to think about those problems and ultimately write papers about them. So to sum up, superheroes reflect real-world issues, and meditating on how the superhero genre depicts and reflects real-world issues can help us become better readers and better writers. I've kept this lesson at one part. This would be a logical place to split it up, but I'm going to try to keep my analysis of Civil War very tight and succinct for you, so I haven't split the lesson into parts. Identifying patterns. I think this is the place to start in terms of going through our critical reading strategies. Because you've already watched the film. If you want to go back and rewatch it, pause it, take notes, try to summarize it in your own words, you should, and you do that with anything you're going to critically analyze from this point forward. But for the sake of the lecture, let's start a step after summary with the first step of going deeper. Changing speed, taking notes, and summarizing are all things that prepare us for the critical reading. But then we'll actually dive deep with the other steps, and the first of those is identifying patterns. So with Civil War or any visual text, you want to look for repeated images, just like you would look for repeated words in an essay or article. So I've chosen to focus in on Captain America's shield because it appears quite frequently throughout this film. Here's the same picture I used at the start of the lecture. Gosh, it's a good picture. I love seeing Falcon up there and Black Panther and Vision, all these heroes. But you'll notice at the back of the image, you have Captain America's shield. You've got, the red on one side for Iron Man, the blue on the other side for Cap. So it really encapsulates the film, and you could see why the creators would use this image to promote the film. But Captain America's shield shows up over and over again. So that, to me, is a visual cue. Let's think about why. But first, here are some more examples. Another smaller poster, or DVD cover, really. It's there as well. It was part of the comic book series on which the film is based. And here you can see it must be toward the end of Civil War because you've got the blood-spattered shield. So even when Cap isn't in the actual image, the shield remains very important. And here, of course, Cap and Iron Man fighting. Of course, his shield is going to be an image of him fighting, and he's one of the central characters. So it would make sense, that the shield is always there. And I know I haven't plucked these images directly from the film. They're more from promotional material, and in this case, the comic series the film is based on. But if you watch the film, it shows up quite frequently as well. And I chose the final battle scene between Cap and Iron Man, which is an image pulled basically directly from the comics, as the canvas cover photo for our Canvas site for this class for this reason. And so the shield is featured prominently not only in the comics, the promotional material, but in the film itself. And I really wanted to show that. So why? The shield is the American flag. So when you have a promotional image with the shield half blue, half red, it no longer is just Captain America's shield. It's come to represent so much more than that. And at the end of the film, when Tony's walking away and Cap says something about a shield, Tony says, "My dad made it." So there's a sense that these two individuals, Captain America and Iron Man, the shield belongs to both of them in a sense. And so it, as a repeated image, a visual cue, represents what they're fighting over. And what's painted on it? America, the American flag. You have a character named Captain America who dresses himself and the American flag, that's not a very subtle image. But here we have it. But by integrating it with Tony and making it so it belongs to both of them, and giving colors on the promotional material that represent both sides, what you get is Tony and Cap fighting over America. And so that's a key idea or key theme from the film depicted through a key image. The same way a key word, like stupid games from the last lecture, conveys an idea. If the shield represents America, then America is also a recurring theme or recurring pattern throughout the film. So all of this identifying of patterns leads us to ask the question, what is the film saying about America, or specifically the United States of America? And so these patterns can lead us to analyzing the argument eventually. I would say what this communicates about the film, or about the U.S., is that the political divides in the film are reminiscent of the political divides in our country and the larger world. So this is one of the times in our country's history where political division is more rife than it's ever been. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. And so Tony and Cap fighting over the shield represents Tony and Cap fighting over America, which represents the political division in our countries, two sides fighting over our country. So here, in just about 5 minutes of critically reading a visual text, we've already gotten way beyond the surface level. How does this kind of pulling on this thread, unraveling this pattern, then tell us about the argument of the text, which is our next step? After we've identified patterns, use those patterns as keys to unlocking the argument, and once we know the argument, play the believing and doubting game with it. So what is the message or argument? We'll get to that in a second. As kind of a way into answering that question, I would say the central theme is responsibility versus freedom. Now that's not an argument, because I'd have to take a stance on that debate. But I'm saying this debate is at the center of the movie. So you could call the debate of responsibility versus freedom another key concept or key theme from the film. And if we pull on this thread, we'll get even closer to the argument. And so you have, on the one side, Tony representing responsibility, and the other side, Cap representing freedom. And so all those images we just analyzed reflect this main or central theme, tension, really a debate. So what do I mean when I say responsibility? The international setting of the film shows the problems with a lack of accountability for the Avengers' actions. So they go through all these countries where the Avengers have fought villains and caused collateral damage, civilians getting hurt. And it starts with the intense action sequence at the beginning of the film in Laos, where Wanda accidentally kills some civilians trying to save Cap from a bomb. And I think the international setting is very important. You then have Berlin, you have like the national conference of the leaders from all those worlds gathering, and then there you have the assassination of T'Chaka from Wakanda, the African country, and that really sets in motion the main events of the film. And T'Challa is really the most important character, probably fourth most important character. After Cap, Iron Man, and Bucky, you could argue that T'Challa is the fourth most important character. So it's interesting. It's a film that has the American flag everywhere you look, and you could argue is about political division in America, but then there's a very international setting, and very few scenes actually take place in the U.S. And so to understand Tony's argument for responsibility or accountability of the Avengers' actions, you need to see how their consequences of their actions have spilled over into other countries. And when you look at it from that way, if we're playing the believing game with Tony's side, responsibility, it really makes sense. I don't think anyone argues that the Avengers need some form of accountability. But what kind of accountability do they need, and what is going too far with that? That's Cap's argument back. So on the other end of the spectrum, you have freedom. Is government oversight the best means of providing accountability? Cap likes to say throughout the film several times, so this is almost like a key phrase, I believe the safest hands are still our own. So he believes the Avengers need to hold themselves accountable. And then that's the best form of accountability. That's Cap's argument, which is the ultimate form of freedom, holding oneself accountable. Now, that can be a problematic argument if we want to play the doubting game for a minute with Cap, because it can be really difficult for human beings, flawed human beings. And the Avengers are very much flawed human beings. That's the rationale for us studying this. All humans are flawed. And so if we're going to use superheroes as a lens to help us become better readers and writers, they have to be flawed, and they are. So in that sense, the safest hands being their own is a problematic idea. But if they go along with what Tony wants, the Sokovia Accords, then the United Nations will just be able to dictate everything the Avengers do. And the people in the United Nations are no less flawed than the Avengers themselves. So Cap is making the argument here that if they agree to what Tony wants to agree with, then they become basically a weapon to be mobilized by some other flawed human. And so now you can see the believing and doubting for both sides. And so if we're to say, what is the argument of this film? Is it more for responsibility or more for freedom? We have to play the believing and doubting game. Play the tape to the end. For Cap's side, freedom, and Iron Man and Tony's side, responsibility. And I don't actually have the answer here, which is really intriguing, and actually one of the reasons why I picked this film. I think it's very open to interpretation. The articles that I've asked you to read and analyze in your discussion board post actually debate this. And the first article argues that the way the film is made, you basically have to side with Cap. And then the other person responds, and then the original author responds back, and it's this great debate. So if you haven't read those articles yet, read all three of them in the order I posted them. I think you'll really enjoy them if you enjoy this film. And it's true that Cap seems to know what the truth is here, that Bucky has been set up and that Tony is being manipulated. But that's one specific situation. And the question of responsibility versus freedom exists on a much larger scale than that. That's just one specific example to help us try to answer that debate. And just because Cap is on the side of freedom, and he happens to be right in the particular scenario of this film, doesn't fully answer the question. But what's great about this film is it gets us to think about these issues. And thinking about these issues is really the goal. Like I said, writing can help us create change. But we don't just roll out of bed in the morning and all of a sudden we can write great papers and people read them and agree with us and things change. We have to get there. And superheroes can help us get here. And like I said, why can superheroes help us get there? Because superhero films really reflect the larger context from which they emerge. With this one in particular, it parallels our real world in that the collateral damage from the Avengers battles is reminiscent of the 9/11 terrorist attacks. The first article I asked you to read mentions this a little bit. But you have these big attacks in New York, Washington, D.C., Sokovia, Laos, that are the impetus or the motive for the government trying to force the Avengers to have more oversight. And particularly the one in New York, but all of them are very similar to 9/11. 9/11, I know some of you, it happened over 20 years ago, so for some of you, this may not be the most familiar subject matter, but it was an incredibly traumatic event on the American consciousness. And to this day, writers are still writing stories and essays about it, trying to grapple with the trauma caused by 9/11, and superhero films have entered into that attempt to grapple with the trauma of 9/11. But there's much more to it than this. In the wake of 9/11, the aftermath of it, responsibility versus freedom was an important debate because the government passed all kinds of new laws, like the laws that enhanced security at airports, the Patriot Act, which allowed much more government surveillance beyond what the original Constitution allowed, other infringes upon freedom in order to protect against similar terrorist attacks. And that's essentially what's happening. Is there's New York, Washington, D.C., Sokovia, and Laos, all these innocent people die because of the superheroes using their powers to fight supervillains. The government's saying with more responsibility or more accountability, more oversight, less freedom, we can potentially prevent these attacks. So 9/11, very traumatic, very important. But 20 years ago, this film is 5 years old. How does it even more so relate to things going on today? Well, when it was released 5 years ago was just a few months before the Trump-Clinton election in 2016. And even at that point, even that early in 2016, the debates over Trump versus Hillary, much like the debates over Trump versus Biden, were really wrapping up and getting very tense. And so when you have two larger-than-life figures like Captain America and Iron Man split on different sides of the shield representing the American flag, some pretty clear parallels here. And I think all the problematic things that were true about the Trump-Clinton election were also true about the Clinton-Biden election, the Trump-Biden election. And so it's just as relevant 5 years later, which is why we're watching it in this class. And as someone who's probably much older than most of you in this class, but still relatively young person, I can say, but who has friends and family members who are in their 70s. And I lived through some pretty intense things in my life, although I feel I've had a pretty blessed life. But I know people, relatives and friends who lived through things like Vietnam. Like Vietnam, take that in for a second, who say that the political divides in our country are sharper than they've ever been. And even though my lifespan so far is only about half of theirs, I know that it's true for me, for my lifespan. So you have a film called Civil War coming out at a time when the political divides in our country are sharper than they have ever been. Finally, ask, is responsibility versus freedom an important debate during the COVID-19 pandemic? I think ultimately 9/11 will be a more traumatic, more scarring event, at least for people in the United States. But obviously the COVID-19 pandemic is much more present and real and actually, still going on for all of us, but especially for you young people. And what's interesting is freedom versus responsibility, I would argue, is central to that debate as well, or the numerous debates that surround the pandemic. I mean, because on the one hand, you have a certain amount of responsibility necessary to combat a virus, but on the other hand, most of the plans the government instituted to combat the virus greatly infringed on the freedoms of the American people and still do. So you take this film that's clearly engaging with the trauma of 9/11 and dealing with the debates that arose in the aftermath of it, and the same exact issues are the ones being debated around the problem most persistent in today's society. And so this film is still very relevant 5 years later. But like I said, superheroes like Cap and Iron Man are a tool, a means, a mediator to help us address the issues of our day. So how does this film make us better readers and better writers? Well, it makes us better readers by forcing us to think deeply about it and come up with the things we discussed in this lecture. How does it make us better writers? Well, just as one example, the COVID-19 pandemic, freedom versus responsibility, that's looking at the issue in a binary way. Like there's only two ways to solve a problem. If we really want to solve any problems, we have to look at them in a non-binary way. There has to be more than two possible answers. So that means we need to think critically, think deeply, and seeing films like this, seeing characters grapple with the same issues helps cast them in a new light. So I don't know if Tony Stark would argue that everyone should get vaccinated and wear masks, and Captain America would argue that people are able to take responsibility for their actions and should individually make those choices. But seeing the choices they made in this film can just give us another thing to think about as we try to solve complex problems. So the last question I would ask is, does the film help you think through these issues in new ways? And that's the key word, is writing papers for this class, we can take on real world issues and we can try to come up with new, unique, creative, innovative ways, things people haven't thought of yet for addressing those problems. And just maybe, looking at superhero films can help us do that. It's one example. You'll see other examples and use other examples yourself, both from and not from the superhero genre this quarter. But hopefully critically reading this text, going beyond the written word with it, will give you the means to critically read other texts and eventually arrive at new ways of solving problems so that you can create change.